All right, let's start the second half of chapter 14 and finish the respiratory system by talking about respiratory physiology. So we've got here two types of respiration, and respiration is gas exchange. There is external respiration, which is gas exchange, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the body's tissues and the external environment. So like the arterial blood and the external environment. So the air that you breathe in, full of oxygen, that oxygen diffuses into the blood, that's external respiration. That's happening at the lungs. There's gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood. Internal respiration is basically the absorption of that oxygen and the production of and diffusion of carbon dioxide out of the tissue cells and into the blood. So it's the opposite direction. Air is moving from the external environment into the blood in external respiration, or oxygen is moving in, carbon dioxide is leaving. And then in the tissue, oxygen is leaving the blood and heading into the tissue cells, and carbon dioxide is being produced there and heading back into the blood from the tissue cells, all the way to be transported back to where external respiration occurs. Ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. So no gas exchange is occurring in this activity. So it's just the act of moving air into and out of the lungs. And that helps maintain alveolar ventilation, which is just basically air that moves into and out of the alveoli. That air that moves into and out of the alveoli is involved in gas exchange, which is respiration. So ventilation has to happen for respiration to occur. And external respiration, here's an overview slide. External respiration, again, is happening at the lungs. Oxygen is diffusing from the air that you breathe in into the arterial blood, into red blood cells, and carbon dioxide is being transported out of those red blood cells into the alveoli to be breathed out, right? So follow the red oxygen and the blue carbon dioxide. The oxygen that's diffused into the blood during external respiration is transported by way of the blood to the tissue, where that oxygen is diffused out of the blood and into the tissue to be used for energy production. And carbon dioxide during energy production is produced and then diffused out of the tissue into the blood, into red blood cells, to be transported back to the lungs where external respiration occurs, and that carbon dioxide can be diffused into the alveoli and then breathed out. So it's one big circuit. In any closed system, like think about a balloon or the lungs, a change in volume, so if you increase the volume in a cavity, so take a look here. Here's a fixed system or a closed system. Think about one of your lungs, the right lung or the left lung. If you increase the size of that lung or the size of that chamber without changing how much stuff is inside that chamber, pressure drops. There's fewer particles floating around in that, or the same number of particles floating around in a larger space. So that decreases the pressure. If you change that to a smaller space, with the same amount of particles inside here, that increases the pressure that those particles put against the walls of that space. So pressure and volume are related. This is called Boyle's law. If pressure in a fixed system, in a closed system, so this closed system, there's no way for air to get in or out. So there's the same amount of air in here right now. If you increase the size of that chamber, the pressure drops. So if you increase the volume here, how much space you have, pressure drops. If you decrease the volume, pressure increases. And changes in pressure and volume are basically how air is moved into and out of the lungs, and the shape by changing the shape of the thoracic cavity. So now our chamber is our thoracic cavity, where our lungs are located. And our major muscle of ventilation, of breathing, is our diaphragm. The diaphragm, if you feel your ribs, where the bottom of your ribs, your diaphragm kind of cups up underneath the ribs. So we'll look at this here shortly. And when the diaphragm is relaxed and it's a resting muscle, it's actually shaped like an upside down bowl. And when it contracts, that bowl upside down flattens out into a plate. So contracting diaphragm moves inferiorly, flattens out, and moving the rib cage superiorly up, kind of expanding the rib cage. Think about lifting your chest up, taking a big deep breath in. That increases the volume in the thoracic cavity. So take a look here. Right here is the diaphragm. And when the diaphragm contracts, it flattens out and increases the volume where the dotted line is. It increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Remember, if you increase the volume in a cavity, the pressure decreases. Remember that. And then the rib cage also, there's muscles that pull on the rib cage and pull it superiorly in this direction, all of which increases the volume in the thoracic cavity. So take a look here. Right here's the diaphragm. The lungs run alongside the diaphragm, okay? So this big muscle, this muscle here is really important. And remember that we've got parietal pleura and the visceral pleura that create the pleural cavity, right? So this white layer here is the pleural cavity. And this muscle is the diaphragm. When you inhale, to cause that to happen, the diaphragm, remember I said right here, the dotted line is the diaphragm relaxed. The diaphragm is relaxed and the shape of the lungs is relatively small. The diaphragm contracts and flattens out. When the diaphragm goes from the relaxed, where the dotted line is, to contracted and it flattens out, that increases the volume in the thoracic cavity. And if you increase the volume in the thoracic cavity, what does that do to pressure inside the thoracic cavity? Remember, pressure and volume are inversely related. So if volume increases, pressure decreases. And when pressure decreases in the thoracic cavity, it decreases below atmospheric pressure, and air basically runs down its pressure gradient into the lungs. So air flows in as pressure in the thoracic cavity inside your chest drops below atmospheric pressure. So air will move down a pressure gradient, and it'll flow into the lungs when pressure is lower than it is outside. The opposite happens for you to breathe out. So the diaphragm was contracted, now it's relaxed, and it pushes up into the thoracic cavity and decreases the volume in this cavity. And as the volume decreases, pressure increases above atmospheric pressure and forces air out of the lungs. So these muscles of respiration, of ventilation, to inhale, the diaphragm is the major muscle of inhalation. And another set of muscles called the external intercostals, between the ribs, costals. And there's a set of external intercostals that help you inspire, breathe in, and there's also a set of internal intercostal muscles between the ribs that help you breathe out. So the diaphragm and the external intercostals are involved in what we call quiet breathing, which is just normal breathing while you're sitting here listening to this video. If you want to forcefully inspire, breathe in really, really hard and expand your chest cavity. Take in as much air as you possibly can. Do that for me. Take a big deep breath in. You move other muscles or contract other muscles like the pectoralis minor, the scalene muscles, and the sternocleidomastoid muscle to help the diaphragm and external intercostals do their job. So in quiet breathing, active inhalation involves the diaphragm and external intercostals. Exhalation, breathing out, is relatively passive because the diaphragm is just relaxing, pushing up into the thoracic cavity, and the external intercostals are not contracting. They're relaxing as well. So that basically inhalation in quiet breathing is active because there's two muscles contracting, these two. Exhalation is passive. So it's just a relaxation of those muscles that helps decrease the volume in the thoracic cavity and push air out. So take a look here. Right here's your diaphragm, and right here's the external intercostal muscles between the ribs. So there's one rib and another rib. There's external. Here's the internal intercostal muscles that would help you breathe out. This helps you breathe in. There's another couple accessory muscles here. There's the sternocleidomastoid. Right here's some scalene muscles and the pectoralis minor. All of these muscles contract and pull the rib cage up superiorly and help you breathe in actively, right? So here's active inspiration. So there's the external intercostal muscles that pull the lower rib towards the upper rib, help you breathe in. The diaphragm contracts and flattens out and pulls in this direction, which increases the volume in the thoracic cavity. The pectoralis minor, the scalenes, and the sternocleidomastoid all pull the rib cage superiorly, while the diaphragm contracts and runs inferiorly and increases the volume in the thoracic cavity, which decreases pressure and helps you breathe in. There are no primary expiratory muscles. So there's primary inspiratory muscles, the diaphragm and the external intercostals. But when you breathe out in just quiet breathing, it's just those muscles relaxing, decreasing the size of the thoracic cavity, the volume, and increasing pressure, which pushes air out. But to expire forcefully, you've got another set of muscles here. Internal intercostals I've mentioned. There's another muscle called the transversus thoracis. I'll show you that. External obliques, internal obliques, and the rectus abdominis. So these four muscles are your abdominal muscles. So once you take a big, huge, deep breath in as hard as you can, and then take a big, deep breath out and force it out as hard as you can. What muscles can you feel you're using as you're pushing air out? Those muscles, your abdominal muscles, those muscles you're using to actively exhale. So take a look. Right there's your rectus abdominis, your external oblique here, your internal oblique, and your transverse thoracis runs transversely this way. We can't really see it. There it is. Transverse thoracis, there it is. It helps pull down the rib cage. So those muscles are all expiratory muscles that pull the rib cage inferiorly as the diaphragm relaxes and pushes up superiorly, decreasing the volume in the thoracic cavity and forcing air out. So as that process happens, air that you move into and out of the lungs during just one cycle, one inhalation and one exhalation, is called tidal volume. So it's the amount of air moved into or out of the lungs during one respiratory cycle. Just one inhalation, one exhalation. And that averages about 1/2 liter. But only about 350 milliliters of that is involved in gas exchange, because there's some air that gets trapped in the conducting airways. The conducting airways, remember, don't exchange gas. Just the respiratory airways are involved in gas exchange. So there's only about 150 milliliters that gets trapped in like the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles that aren't involved in gas exchange, those conducting airways. And beyond tidal volume, so just sit and breathe normally for 10 seconds. One normal in-breath, one normal out-breath is a tidal volume. But you have air that you can still breathe in after you breathe in just a normal in-breath, right? So breathe all that air in. As much air as you can breathe in from the top of your normal in-breath is called your inspiratory reserve volume. It's the amount of air that you can breathe in beyond a normal tidal volume. You also have expiratory reserve volume, the amount of air you can breathe out beyond a normal quiet exhalation. So those two volumes are basically the air that you're able to breathe in if you need to. It's like your reserve. How much air do you have left that you can breathe in beyond a normal tidal volume? So if you need to, like if you just have tidal volume while you're sitting or standing or laying down, but if you need to go out and run or exercise, you need to be able to breathe in more air. So those reserve volumes are there so that you can do that. A vital capacity is a volume, a capacity that you can measure, but it's the maximum amount of air that you can move into and out of your lungs in one cycle. So think about taking as much air in as you can and then breathing out as much air as you can breathe out. That's your vital capacity, the most amount of air you can move into and out of your lungs in one inhalation, one exhalation. And if you breathe out all the air that you can breathe out, there's still some air left in your lungs. So do that for me. Breathe out all the air that you can breathe out as much as you can forcefully. Use your ab muscles, use all the muscles you can to breathe out as much air as possible. Even if you breathe out all the air that you can, as much as possible, there's still air left in your lungs. And that's called residual volume. If you add that to a vital capacity, you get what's called total lung capacity, the total amount of air that the lungs can actually hold, including the air that's left even after you breathe out completely. And that average is about 5 liters, and it can average from about 4.2 liters or 4,200 milliliters to 6,000 or 6 liters in male. So here's on a graph, and you may see this graph coming up in the future. Right here is volume over time. So here's a normal breathing rate. So on a spirometer, we can measure these lung volumes or capacities. So right here is a normal tidal volume. Remember I said it's about half a liter, 22 to 2,700 is 500 milliliters. So this whole volume is a tidal volume. One normal in breath, an upward deflection, and an out breath. Dang it. The expiratory reserve volume is from the normal out breath to as much air as you can breathe out, expiratory reserve volume. And then an inspiratory reserve volume is from as much air as you can, from the top of a normal in-breath, sorry, I keep clicking forward, to as much air as you can breathe in. So that's your reserve volume on inspiration versus your reserve volume on expiration. Your vital capacity is as much air as you can breathe in to as much air as you can breathe out. There's vital capacity. And the air that's left in the lungs after you breathe out all the air that you can breathe out is residual volume. And if you add residual volume to vital capacity, you get total lung capacity. So on this graph includes all the volumes we just mentioned. What we're going to finish chapter 14 with is gas diffusion. Oxygen moves from where there is more oxygen to where there's less. So there's a concentration gradient or a pressure gradient that derives oxygen from where it's high to where it's low. Similar to any other gas, like carbon dioxide. Where carbon dioxide is high, it'll diffuse to where it's low. So remember, in external respiration, in the alveoli, oxygen is high. But in the venous blood, oxygen's low. So oxygen in external respiration diffuses down its concentration and pressure gradient from where it's an area of high to where it's an area of low. Carbon dioxide in that same blood is high in the blood, but low in the alveoli. So carbon dioxide diffuses out. The opposite happens in internal respiration. Oxygen leaves the blood, heads into the tissue, and CO2 is being produced and diffuses out into the blood to be carried all the way back to the lungs where external respiration occurs. Blood in the pulmonary arteries has low oxygen. Remember, pulmonary arteries are what send blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs. So oxygen is low and carbon dioxide is high, right? Deoxygenated blood. So oxygen tends to flow from the alveoli where it's high. You just breathe air in into the capillary right here. And then CO2 diffuses out. In internal respiration, oxygen is high in the capillary and CO2 is low, so the reverse happens. Oxygen diffuses out of the blood into the tissue, and CO2 diffuses out of the tissue into the blood. And that oxygen and carbon dioxide, they're transported by the blood, but they're transported in a couple of ways. Oxygen in the pulmonary capillaries is picked up, oxygen is diffused from the alveoli into the blood and bound to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is this molecule that basically transports, and you can find it inside red blood cells. And hemoglobin binds to, one hemoglobin molecule can bind to 4 oxygens. And then in that red blood cell, as red blood cells are transported through the blood, oxygen is carried in hemoglobin, bound to hemoglobin through the blood, and is then delivered to the tissue in internal respiration, where hemoglobin releases that oxygen and diffuses into the tissue. Carbon dioxide can be dissolved in the plasma. So it actually, gases, both carbon dioxide and oxygen can dissolve in the plasma. So like you would dissolve, like think about a soda where there's fizzy bubbles. That's gas dissolved in a liquid. So gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide can dissolve in the liquid, our plasma in blood. But carbon dioxide can also be bound to hemoglobin. So when oxygen content's low in the blood and carbon dioxide content's high, carbon dioxide can basically take the place of oxygen bound to hemoglobin, and then can be transported in the venous blood back to the heart and then out to the lungs to be expired. Well, there's a third way that carbon dioxide can be transported that oxygen can't be transported this way. So these first two are also ways that oxygen can be transported. Carbon dioxide can be converted, because carbon dioxide is an acid and it can cause changes in pH in the blood, which is not good. So to prevent changes in pH and acidity in the blood, carbon dioxide is combined with water to form what we call carbonic acid. And that's a really weak acid. It splits really quickly to a hydrogen ion and what's called bicarbonate. And this bicarbonate, see CO3 here? So CO2, carbon dioxide, is carried in the blood and can't affect acidity because it's bound to this molecule. It's located in this molecule and kind of masked as bicarbonate. So here, take a look at what happens. Oxygen and carbon dioxide pick up in delivery. So oxygen pickup, there's alveoli, diffuses oxygen from the alveolar space into the blood, and then binds to hemoglobin. Oxygen can also, here's the plasma, this kind of tan is the fluid component of blood, is dissolved in the plasma. So oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood, dissolves in the plasma, and then binds to hemoglobin in red blood cells. And then when it gets delivered, the opposite happens. Oxygen dissociates from hemoglobin and diffuses out of red blood cells to the plasma. From the plasma, it then diffuses into the tissue. And those red blood cells then pick up carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide dissolves in the plasma, diffuses into red blood cells, can bind to carbon dioxide in one way, and then can also be converted to bicarbonate, which then gets pumped back out into the plasma. That carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma, bound to hemoglobin, or forming bicarbonate, which is a buffer in your blood, gets transported back to the lungs, where all of those reverse and diffuse carbon dioxide out of the blood and into the alveolar space to be breathed out, expired. When you breathe more rapidly, when you increase your breathing rate or decrease your breathing rate, your body subconsciously controls that. So think about when you're stimulated to yawn, or when you go from sitting to standing, or standing to walking or running, your breathing rate increases. And if you go from walking to sitting, your breathing rate decreases. Well, there's areas in your brainstem, your pons, and in your medulla oblongata that subconsciously control that. So your control centers for respiration, for breathing, are located in the pons and the medulla oblongata. And if carbon dioxide changes in the blood, usually carbon dioxide is the trigger for changes in breathing, because carbon dioxide is produced from your tissues. Usually your body's really good at maintaining a normal level of oxygen, so oxygen concentrations aren't really a trigger for this. But when arterial carbon dioxide increases, that's called hypercapnia. What can cause that is hypoventilation, a low breathing rate. That stimulates chemoreceptors. Chemoreceptors respond to a chemical like carbon dioxide. And that response in chemoreceptors, they send a signal to the pons and the medulla oblongata. And the pons and the medulla oblongata are your integrating centers for respiration. And then they control basically your breathing rate. So if you hypoventilate and you increase carbon dioxide concentrations in the blood, those chemoreceptors respond, send signals to the medulla and the pons, and the medulla and the pons then send information to like your diaphragm to increase breathing rate. The opposite happens, hypocapnia, too low of carbon dioxide, and that stimulates basically, that can be caused by hyperventilation, breathing too quickly, which decreases carbon dioxide levels in the blood, and that would then stimulate your medulla and your pons to tell your breathing muscles to slow down. That decreases respiratory rate. So here's the summary of how that happens. Increased carbon dioxide levels, hypercapnia, stimulates the chemoreceptors, sends signals to the medulla and the pons, and that stimulates respiratory muscles to increase breathing rate and expire more carbon dioxide, keep hitting that button, and expire more carbon dioxide and bring carbon dioxide levels in the blood back down. The opposite happens, where if carbon dioxide levels are too low, hypocapnia, that inhibits chemoreceptors from firing to the medulla and the pons, and the medulla and the pons then send motor neurons to the respiratory muscles to slow them down and decrease breathing rate, which decreases the elimination of carbon dioxide and allows it to build back up in the blood towards normal. So follow those. That's a really good review slide. When we have problems with breathing, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, is a broad term or a general term for some specific conditions like asthma, chronic bronchitis. Anything with itis is an inflammation, so the inflammation of the bronchioles or bronchi. And then emphysema is a third example of COPD. Asthma we've mentioned a little bit in the last lecture, but it's typically an allergic reaction where you're sensitive to some irritation, and that causes a bronchoconstriction. So the smooth muscle around bronchioles constricts and decreases airflow into the alveolar spaces. You could stimulate the increase in mucus production, and that also comes along with inflammation. And triggers to that can include allergies, even exercise. Exercise in like cold and dry weather can stimulate an asthmatic attack, and even stress sometimes. Chronic bronchitis. And again, anything with itis is an inflammation. It's a long chronic inflammation and swelling in the bronchial lining. And that usually stimulates an overproduction of mucus that can clog airways. Smoking is a cause of so many problems. Don't do it. If you're smoking, quit, please. Cigarette smoking is the leading cause of chronic bronchitis, but it can also be caused by other environmental irritants. Anything that you're allergic to can cause some inflammation and chronic bronchitis. And that can usually lead to infection, where there's inflammation, where there's overproduction of mucus. Remember, mucus traps pathogens and debris. And if you're producing too much, that infection and those bacterial cells can stay in the airways longer, and they can grow and cause infection. And that can also lead to swelling in the thoracic cavity, which can cause problems with the heart, and even cause problems with gas exchange, which leads to low oxygen levels in the skin, or low oxygen levels in the arterial blood, which leads to a bluish tint in the skin. Emphysema is basically a destruction of the alveolar surfaces or the respiratory surface area. So think about how alveolar sacs are created like clusters of grapes. Well, those clusters lose their surface area. And if you lose surface area, then you can inhibit gas exchange, and also can basically cause an overexpansion in the lungs, which can compromise compliance in the lungs. If they're overexpanded, and the alveolar surfaces are destroyed, gas exchange is inhibited. In lung cancer, again, smoking, don't do it, guys. If you're doing it, quit it. It's really bad for you. There's no benefits at all. Lung cancer accounts for basically 12% of new cancer cases in both men and women, and more than half die within a year of diagnosis. So lung cancer is crazy. 85 to 90% of the cases are a direct result of cigarette smoking. If that doesn't scare you into stopping, I don't know what will. Secondhand smoke. So think about your family members or your friends that are around you while you're smoking, or that you are around while somebody else is smoking. If you know somebody who smokes, give them that statistic. That is scary. And a non-smoker that lives with a smoker has a 20 to 30% greater chance of developing lung cancer. So don't if you're smoking, don't do that to other people in your life. And don't do that to yourself. As you get older, everything gets worse, right, guys? So the skeletal system and connective tissues become less elastic and flexible, which makes it harder for your lungs to expand in that thoracic cavity. Over the age of 50, there's some level of damage in the alveoli, and because of the loss of elastic connective tissue, which can mimic or cause some form of emphysema. And inevitably, there's smoking again. A decline in respiratory performance is inevitable. It just happens with age. But you can make it worse, and you can decline faster because of smoking. So I'm going to say it again. If you're smoking, stop. If you know somebody who's smoking, help them stop. If you're living with somebody that's smoking, give them a hard time about it. Don't smoke. That's my final word. And that ends this chapter. I will see you in chapter 15.